forward with the tutorial itself. Okay. So last time, as I mentioned, we did B2B marketing, and this time we're going to be focusing on B2C. What is B2C marketing? Business to consumer, business to consumer and your customer directly, and not business to business. And for this part of the tutorial, we'll be focusing on your psychological influences that that affects a customer's decision process. Of course, there are different influences like your marketing makes, socio-cultural influences, which would be maybe the kind of society you come from, or your reference groups, your peer groups, your situational influences, which would be your surroundings. But we are focusing on prospect theory in this, in the initial phases, and then we are focusing on irrational behavior. And so let's focus on the psychological influences that affect consumer behavior and how marketers accordingly frame their marketing strategy. So what is prospect theory? Does anyone have an idea? Raise your hand or unmute yourselves. Okay, so prospect theory is something that we use in academia to explain decision making. It's a decision making theory. It's a descriptive decision making theory, whereby customers may be given several options, and depending on how it's framed, or depending on the expected value of an outcome, a customer may choose A option over B, or may choose B option over C. And if you all do the MMM in the future, this theory will be explained in much detail in decision analysis or business economics. But as of now, we're sticking to a very basic idea of decision making and using prospect theory and a point of reference around which your entire prospect theory focuses. And how does it help with marketing? It helps marketers to frame their message, to give different options, or to frame it in XYZ manner over a simple manner. Say, for example, 20% off by marking up a price and then showing 20% off is always more attractive to a customer than having to buy something at a lower price itself without any discount being shown. It helps positioning new products in the market. It also helps understanding the premium which a customer might be willing to pay based on his preferences. And as I mentioned earlier, there's this point of reference that you can see. And everything in prospect theory revolves around this, wherein your gains are always concave. Gains are always concave shaped curves, and your losses are always convex shaped curves. That's why below you can see a convex curve, and above you can see a concave curve. Someone's typed something in the chat. Could you please explain segregation? Sorry, I don't understand your question, Lisa. Maybe you can unmute and speak out. For the editing phase. No, I don't understand. I would request you to maybe unmute and speak about what you're talking about.
Okay, so in the lecture, we had this editing phase, and there were like 3 things you could do. It was coding, combination, and segregation. And I didn't understand segregation. Could you maybe explain this one?
Let me see if I have time after the tutorial, because this tutorial is relatively long. Otherwise, go ahead and post these things on Ilyas if it's not being covered, because unfortunately, I won't be able to complete what I have to complete otherwise. So let's see if we have time at the end. But otherwise, I'm sorry, I will have to move on with at least what I'm asked to complete. Yeah, going back to value functions for prospect theory. So there are different value functions that guide behaviors of people. And let's start with the third one. So you'll always realize that whenever, for example, you're in a situation whereby, say, you applied for an internship or applied for a university and you don't get in, your loss or the regret may loom for a larger period of time or a longer period of time than a gain. Whereas, okay, if you get into a university or you get the internship, you may just celebrate for a day, or you may be happy about it and then go back to complaining about something else. Similarly, if you take the stock market, for you guys who invest into the stock market, if you have a gain, you're like, okay, my portfolio is growing or I've made a profit. But if there's a loss, you immediately get bothered about it. And so this is the concept of losses loom larger than gains. Your second value function explains the concave for gains and convex for losses idea. So the example here is you have a monetary value of 30 and 20 versus you have a monetary value of 200 and 190. Now the absolute difference between both is 10, but 20, the difference between 20 and 30 seems much greater than the difference between 190 and 200. And that's why you may describe it as, okay, I'm seeing it percentage wise or whatever you see it as, but that's how consumers react to situations like these. And the first concept is basically your perceived gains and losses are relative to the neutral reference point. So just as an example from the second function, your perceived changes are more than what may be in absolute levels. So people appear to respond more to perceived changes than to absolute levels. And that's the example that's also there in the second point. And using this, we try to understand prospect theory. And this is the first exercise. I'll take you all through each of these 4 points. So what happens is in multiple gains, you have X and Y as positive numbers. That means the person is making several gains and hasn't lost any amount of money. And that's why V is going to be concave. And your value of X plus your value of Y individually is always going to be greater than your value of X plus Y combined. So in the exercise itself, we'll have a problem where, for example, A wins um, 20 euros at one point of time, and then he wins 60 euros versus B wins 80 euros together. So who's going to be happier? And we see that A is going to be happier because he had a positive win individually twice. And that's how human beings are built. And that's what's being explained by prospect theory, even though ultimately your total net gain is the same. With multiple losses, however, no one wants to be hit by multiple losses all the time. So for example, you get a fine, a bill of 25 euros, and then you get fined another 100 euros versus you just get fined 125 euros together. Obviously, the first time is going to hit you more because it's like 2 rejections versus 1 rejection. So that's how multiple losses react. Mixed gains are where, for example, you have 1 gain and 1 loss. So in a case where your gain, you have a net gain, which is where X will be greater than Y and X is your positive number, you ultimately stand to gain. So say you have a gain of 100 and then you have a loss of 20. Your net off is 80. And in this case, individually, when you're seeing value of X plus value of negative Y, it's lesser than the value of X minus Y because a person is seeing no loss. For example, you have 100 minus 20, which is 80, versus someone says, oh, you just won 80. Obviously, the person who says, oh, I've won 80 is going to be happier because he didn't face any sort of loss or any sort of rejection. And this is mixed gain. However, with mixed losses, where you're ultimately seeing a net loss, and your Y, for example, is greater and your Y is negative, your Y is greater than X, your value of X plus your value of Y in negative Y individually will be greater than value of X minus Y because at least you have 1 gain. So for example, you stand to lose 100 euros and gain 20. So your net loss would be 80 versus just being given a net loss of 80. Obviously, the first holds more value because you feel like, okay, I at least made a gain of 20. So that's the concept behind it. And using this, we'll move on to the next slide where we have different scenarios, and we have scenario A, B, C, D, and I will give you all like 2 minutes to just go through this and try to use the value functions and the mixed gains, mixed losses, multiple gains, multiple losses scenarios and match it to each of these. I'll give you all 2 minutes for this. And I see a question in the chat regarding, could you eventually explain the difference between 1 and 2? So I'll go ahead and explain that as well right now. So this is what I'm assuming you're confused about. And the principle, these are basically behavioral principles. And your first one will say the function is defined over perceived gains and losses relative to some new to some natural reference point. Now, this reference point is generally given in prospect theory. And what they are trying to say is we are reacting to the perceived changes. So, for example, it may seem like a loss of 10 euros when you have 20 versus 30 is greater than 190 versus 200. And here the point that we are making is about the reference point. Or say, for example, you have a reference point of 500 euros and you have a loss of 100. So say your value goes down to 400 versus your value goes up to 600. Your perceived changes are maybe as per how you perceive it basis the 500 reference point over necessarily just €100 net gain or net loss. And your second value function is basically trying to explain just the fact that gains have a concave value function versus losses have a convex value function. And the example that's given here is similar to the first one, and that's because prospect theory revolves around these same principles, which are again all connected. And the explanation would be, I'll go back to the graph over here. Yours is a convex graph versus this is a concave graph. And as you can see, this, for example, if you have a loss, let's say of 20 and a loss of 40 versus a loss of 20 and 40, you can see how it's matching into this convex versus if you have a gain of 20 and a gain of 40 and how it lands up being a concave curve. So that's the basic two value functions. That's the principles that we are using for prospect theory. Now, assuming most of you all went through the scenarios and were able to, anyone wants to unmute and give the answer for what type of scenario A is, and maybe who would be happier by winning, or yeah, who's happier, A or B? Does anyone have the answer?
Mixed gain and then Mr. B.
Exactly. So your answer is absolutely right. The scenario A is a mixed gain, and the reason being you win 200, you lose 180, but ultimately your net off is a gain. And we had an experiment, and over here the experiment had 87 results, out of which 61 people said that yeah, B would be happier because he did not, see any sort of a loss. And this is your value function, wherein you have one positive and one negative, and ultimately a positive. And yeah, your B value is going to be perceived as happier. And this is again how you're just perceiving something, even though the net effect is the same. Alexander, you've raised your hand. Go ahead, shoot your question.
I've actually thought about this a lot, and the question is, so we have sorry, my English is lacking, but we have to match the scenarios to the possible outcomes. And if we look at the scenario, B is a definite gain, and A itself, like Mr. A, is a mixed gain. But I mean, we don't know what the outcome of A is. It's still positive though. So actually Mr. A has a positive, has a net gain, and Mr. B has a net gain. Wouldn't the whole scenario be then multiple gains and just for Mr. A mixed gain? Because I mean, we know that 200 plus minus 180 is less than 20, but we don't know how much less. It could be 18, 17, 16. So it's only a loss. Like for it to be a mixed gain, Mr. A or Mr. B would have to have a loss, right? And none of them has a perceived value loss.
No. So just to clear this out so that the understanding is better, we are considering, for example, what's happening with Mr. A, whether that is a mixed gain or a mixed loss. And since here it's evident that there are two personas and A has 120, has won 200 and lost 180. So 200 minus 180 is 20. So ultimately his net gain is only 20, which is the same as what Mr. B has. But here we are trying to understand who's happier or who's sadder. In the next scenarios, you'll have someone who's sadder. And that's why you can say, oh, A will be happier, because you're seeing A as a mixed gain.
Yeah, I don't think you get what my problem is. I know that the question has two parts, and in the one part we have to say who's happy and who's less happy. But the other part of the question is match each scenario. There's 4 scenarios with one of the 4 possible combinations, right? And in the whole scenario, like Mr. A and Mr. B, they both belong to the same scenario. None of them has a loss, so it can't be mixed gain, because none of them, in fact, is like perceiving their situation negative. One perceives it a little bit less positive than the other. So the whole situation shouldn't be a mixed gain, it should be multiple gains, right?
We refer, so in the slide earlier, for example, we refer, if you see a mixed gain, is where one is positive, one is negative. So in this case, your 200 is positive and your, what was it, 180 is negative.
Yes, but that's just Mr. A, not the whole scenario. So
but
Mr. A himself has mixed gains. Mr. B just has gains, and mixed gains and gains should be multiple gains, right?
Exactly. So we're looking at Mr. A, for example, in this part and comparing the value of 2 of them. So value of X plus Y versus value of X versus value of Y. So look at when in each of the scenario, you're trying to find out who's happier using prospect theory. So we are looking at, Mr. A in this case. So the question says match each scenario with one of the 4 possible outcomes. And that's the only way you can, otherwise, if you have multiple gains, for example, how would you distinguish, say, this one versus part B, where he's winning both times?
But if we have to match each scenario and we say we match Mr. A and we can't match Mr. B to one of the scenarios because Mr. B is just a game. So the way I understood the question is we have to match.
Question is to decide. Question is to decide. So you match the scenario and then you decide who's going to be happier. So over here, for example, we are saying B, you matching the scenario. Okay, it's a mixed gain scenario. And basis this idea that it's a mixed gain, you can tell that, okay, in that case, B will be happier, because when you're comparing a loss and a gain with a net gain, but just versus a net gain, you're saying, okay, this is why B will be happier.
Yeah, I totally got that part, but the question has 2 parts. So in the first part, we decide who's happier, and we can do that by saying, okay, A is obviously a mixed gain and B is just a gain. And then we have the formula that works out. But the second part is match each scenario with one of the 4 possible combinations, right? And if we look at the whole scenario, so the scenario is Mr. A and Mr. B, and both of them have gains, right? So they should be multiple gains instead of mixed gains.
No, because
Mr. A has a mixed gain.
Because if you compare then for scenario B, for example, what would you say? You're not comparing A and B, you're comparing what Mr. A is doing and saying this scenario is a scenario of multiple gain and multiple loss. And to understand the concept of why the value function works out, as for example, in this case, the value of just 20. So the value of X minus Y being greater than value of X or minus Y individually, which is here, we're trying to use it as an example to understand it better. So just look at scenario A. Just look at scenario A and look at, Mr. A in that case and detect whether it's a mixed gain or whether it's a multiple gain.
Right, that's not really clear from the question, right? The wording is look at the whole scenario. Why is B included in the scenario? Then why is it not like
because they're comparing it? So to get the value function, how will you then compare that? Okay, value of X minus Y. You need to compare who's going to be happier. You need Mr. B. Otherwise, how do you compare?
Yeah, no, I don't think. Yeah, that's all right. Thank you very much.
Okay. Then you have scenario B, where you have, as I mentioned already, multiple gains. And the reason being your X value is 70, positive 70, your Y value is positive 20. So the net gain is going to be 90. But as we saw earlier, 2 gains individually are perceived higher than 1 gain, which Mr. B has. And that's why over here we saw that most respondents responded that A would be happier. Then with scenario C, we see that there are multiple losses. For example, over here you have 150 and then 50. Mr. A has been slammed by the authorities, and Mr. B has just been told altogether that he has to pay 200 altogether. And that's why you have a case of multiple losses, where then two losses together is perceived less than one loss together. And that's why value of minus 150 plus value of minus 50 is lesser than value of 200 altogether. And in the last scenario, Mr. D, you see that over here, he has a mixed loss because he has to pay 250 and then he wins 50. Whereas in the second instance where Mr. B has just had to spend 200, we see that, okay, in this case, your individual value of 250 plus value of 50 would be perceived better, greater than value of X minus Y, because there's no sort of gain to offset the loss. So over here we saw that most people would say that, okay, Mr. B is more upset and A is happier. So that's how you use prospect theory, and you use this experiment was just conducted to see even how people perceive things. Two people raise their hand, Alexander and Julius. Alexander, go first, and Julius, maybe you can.
Sorry, just forget to put my hand.
Okay. Julius?
Yeah, what happens when the sum is 0? So if it's neither a net gain or neither a net loss?
Okay, that's a good question, actually. I would say from my knowledge of prospect theory, that's you don't have a reference point in that case. Your reference point, it's again perceived in regards to reference point. But as far as we know with respect to rational behavior, say you're just given a loss of a net loss versus one gain versus one loss. It depends on the individual characteristics, and sometimes people who are more risk, there's this risk factor and risk attitudes of people. So say someone is risk averse, he reacts to something differently as compared to someone who's risk prone versus someone who's risk neutral. So for someone who's risk prone, maybe he would want to play the game and he would want to play the gamble. We refer to these as gambles when we use it in economics. And in that case, he would be wanting to, for example, win 5,000 euros and also be willing to lose 5,000 euros. And that would be more valuable to him because he's risk averse, whereas risk prone, not risk averse, whereas someone who's risk averse would rather just say, okay, I have a loss of 0. I don't want these gambles and I don't want to play the game. So that's where your expected utility theory would come in, and your expected value when you have these different risk attitudes. So that would be a completely different angle. This is not important for your exam, but for your understanding, we see people's risk attitudes to then decide who would be happier, whether that a loss of 0 directly or an outcome of 0 directly would be happier, or maybe first a loss and then a profit. Mina?
I just have a quick question. Like, for example, by scenario A, it's written 22 and 61. What this number stands for?
So, okay, there are 87 participants. So if you, for example, see in each of these, we'll see that, okay, 61 people who participated said that B would be happier. 22 said that A would be happier, whereas 4 said that, there would be no difference in happiness because it's just a gain. So to 4 people, it made no difference. And if you see in all these scenarios, the number of people who are not, indifferent to either of the options are very few. So 2, for example, in this case, 5, for example, in this case. The only time we saw a great number where someone would be indifferent to either of the gambles is where we had multiple gains, where, for example, they won 20 and they won then 70 and 90 was the net gain. But otherwise, everywhere else, we see that prospect theory holds because you see preferences of people and how, it's framed and how it plays out in the minds of people. Hope that answers. Okay. Gi, Evelyn?
Yes, so I also have a question regarding this scenario D, because if you go one slide back, you said that if we consider of this situation, further information is required. Or one more, like 10. Yeah. So how can you decide in the given questions that B is happier? Because in the theory, we need more information.
Like for example, here we just use the concept that your y value is actually greater than your x value, and again, like for example, how much the person wants to play the gamble, these kind of attitudes of the person would be considered. So whether they are willing to take a chance, sometimes people would be willing to settle for a less outcome because it gives them a thrill, for example. That's going deeper into prospect theory. It's not important for you all, but to help why we get this ultimate outcome where the value of x plus the value of negative y is going to be greater than the value of x minus y, where y, which is a negative number, is greater. This is the concept which helps understand that in this scenario, for example, you have 250 spent, so negative 250 and positive 50, and this is perceived better than just 200. That's the concept they are trying to explain through this mixed losses.
Okay, so in the exam, should we just assume that people were like the like risk, so and we just use the formula, or we need to consider more information?
No, in the exam, you all won't be given more information. So you all will most probably be having something very straightforward from the tutorial itself. And in this case, as I mentioned, there's a mixed loss. So you're seeing that ultimately it's not a mixed gain. For example, your mixed gain is when your y figure is lower than your x value, your absolute value of y. And in this scenario, because it's a mixed loss, you see that individually, because of one gain, you're perceiving this to be better than just a net loss.
Okay, so we just say that is just the rule and we need to follow it. Okay, thank you.
And try using just, normal rational behavior as the experiment also suggested, where 63 participants would say that B would be more upset because just as, say, for example, you lose 250 in a stock market and then you win 50, you may feel happier than directly just losing 200.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Sure. The chat has a lot of questions. Yeah, Mr. A is a mixed gain. Okay, someone's answering. If it's mixed gain. Okay, so you guys are helping each other out. That's really nice. I think everyone's questions have been either answered or answered by me or answered by someone else and explained further. So I'm moving on with the next one. Yeah, we have to, exactly. You guys have answered the questions. We have to answer the next one. I mean, going on to the next exercise, we are going to focus on irrational consumer behavior. And we see that there are different cognitive biases that, play out with individuals and human beings, which is why they may behave in an irrational manner, which is not generally expected. Or a rational consumer may go for one option A over option B, but there are these cognitive biases due to which sometimes people behave differently from what's expected. And the first one is, for example, the framing effect. So it refers to, for example, how a problem is put, and we kind of, in the MMM or in higher, when you go onto higher levels, you will realize that we use there's this concept called expected value, where you again have two scenarios, and they have each of them using probabilities has the same value, expected value, but one may be perceived differently because of risk preferences of an individual. And then anchoring effect, you'll realize that when there are, for example, discounts in B2C marketing, or as consumers, we actually see the arbitrary value and we judge it before making any sort of a estimate. So for example, if you're given a discount on something, you may perceive it to be better than something that's on full price but a lower value. your status quo bias is sometimes, you know, as consumers, we are used to doing or used to using a product where we say, okay, our product, we want to focus on, say you're using a SIM card, and you know, Aldi Talk, for example, is the cheapest, and it provides less connectivity, or connectivity in less places. This is just a hypothetical situation, but versus someone who's going in for a more expensive SIM card, because, you know, they want, for example, higher speed internet, they want connectivity in better places. And then we see that even if, for example, SIM card B is priced lower than Aldi Talk, sometimes people might stick to Aldi Talk because they just know that this is the cheapest that's been available, and they're sticking to their status quo. Whereas people, for example, who always want the faster internet, want you know, a better connectivity, even say, for example, Aldi Talk improves those aspects, they might still stick to the one which they went for before, because it's still a superior performing SIM card versus Aldi, even though ultimately you're paying a much higher price for it. Then your endowment effect, for example, you'll generally see this effect playing out with people who are extremely loyal, or people who are in their, you know, late years of their life, for example, senior citizens, wherein a good becomes like, or a certain product becomes so important to them that it becomes a part of their individual identity. So for example, for people who are our age, I mean, as we're not really loyal customers anymore in this generation, but just Apple users, Apple product users, they may be willing to pay so much more for an iPhone, and they would be willing to stick to that itself. And if there are, say, 5 pieces of a phone left, they would still go for that regardless of the price, because they are such big fans of Apple, or they are so Apple becomes like a part of their identity. They cannot imagine using an Android, or can't you imagine using a Samsung Tab. And yeah, with this we had the question, which was exercise 2, where we are given different sort of situations, and you try to identify the cognitive bias present in each of these. Take a minute and just, you know, I'm guessing most of you all by now would have at least seen the exercise, but take a minute and recall your answers, and then we can you know, you all answer me as to what you all think each of the scenarios are. But doesn't that status quo better? The Apple example that I gave, for example, it could also refer to status quo, but here I'm referring to something becoming a part of a person's individual identity. And Apple is just one example, but in, you know, one of these scenarios, we'll see other examples as to how a product, for example, a person would be willing to, you know, give up a lot more than let go of that product. Isn't endowment effect a subset of status quo? No, it's slightly different. When you're seeing psychological or cognitive biases, status quo, for example, is sticking by what you know, versus endowment is more, I would say, like an emotional attachment. So framing, okay. Someone's asked me to go a slide back. I'm going a slide back. And I'll proceed with maybe asking you guys to give in answers or shout out answers for each of these situations. So for the first situation, what type of an effect would you all think this would be?
Framing.
Framing effect, exactly. So framing effect, and the reason being, so for example, this is where you have expected value theory playing in. So if you see 25% chance to gain 32,000 versus and a 75% chance to, where there would be no interest versus 8,000, they are both ultimately having the same value. And we calculate this expected value as using 25% of 32,000 plus 75% of 0. That's how you use probabilities to calculate your, your EV, your expected value. And so basically this would be 25% of 32,000, which is 8,000, the same outcome. And that's the same amount, but the way it's framed may make someone choose one over the other. So for example, independent of each other, they all 9 out of 10 heirs would go for one because they don't want to take a risk. So with respect to risk attitudes, we see that only one, because normally people are risk averse, only one would choose option B, even though the outcome or the expected value is the same. Then the next question that we had was about a girl who's, entering an electric shop and she wants a laptop, wants to buy it. And anyone wants to answer which kind of a cognitive bias might play in at this point? Anchoring, exactly. And this is how, the best way I can explain anchoring effect is with this example. So she says, oh wow, 20% off is $340 off, and she sees this and wants to go in for the purchase. And that's why we say, okay, the anchoring effect may be used quite often when people offer sales or discounts to be in B2C marketing. And with C, here we see that there's a product and people are divided into two groups basis their preferences. One group focuses on a cheaper price versus one group prefers speedy service. And the ultimate result that we saw is that the group that chose speedy service, favored speedy service, stayed with that initial service tariff combination, whereas the people who went in for a lower priced tariff, choose their lower priced combination. And anyone wants to answer which type of bias this would be? Status quo, exactly. And as we can see here, people are sticking to what they know, sticking to what their status quo suggests. And the last example was about a man in his late 50s, and he would normally never buy a bottle of wine for more than $35, but he purchased a bottle in the late 50s for about, in the late 50s. So this would be long back, and the person would be an older person. For $5, obviously the price increased, and he was offered $100. Even though he would never spend that much, he refused to sell it to someone who was willing to pay that much for the bottle of wine. And this is endowment effect. I can see 3 people raising their hands. Okay, so maybe Anton, Hugo. Okay, I don't know who raised their hand first, but
Hugo was before me.
Okay, so Hugo, you go, and then Anton, you can go. Jai, are you also having a question, or is this from the last time?
That's just from last time.
Okay, so Hugo and then Anton.
I have a question regarding C. Does this assume that the group preferring speed had not the option with the highest speed as the present option? Because there's written that they were given a combination, and there's one combination which is slower, but that's not of their interest. That doesn't prove the status quo bias. But this scenario assumes that there's another option which was not given to the group preferring speed, which is even faster, right?
So what they're trying to say is, if you see, afterwards, each group was presented with 4 different possible service and speed combinations, and people just stuck to, for example, people who wanted speedier service, chose to go with, a high speed, higher tariff, and only few people chose the slower option, even if it was.
No, but they were given. And the group favoring speed was already given a service, but they had the opportunity to change it. But the status quo bias would only be confirmed if there was another tariff which they could choose actively, which which would be even faster, right? So
that's I guess what they've been offered. Like they were given 4 different combinations.
but there's one present or not. There's as the present condition. There's written with one of the options being presented as the present condition. So this means they were given the tariff, but they had the opportunity to either stick with it or pick one tariff which is even faster, right?
Exactly. And the people who chose that, would want to stay with the lower sort of a tariff chose to stick.
They stayed with the lower, with the not with the slower one, although they could have chosen a faster one, right? That's my question.
No, Hugo, I think they could change to the less expensive version, so they could change to the other group, but they stayed with their speedy service, and the group with the cheap tariff stayed with their cheap version. Although maybe both aspects are equally important to customers in general when you go and choose a tariff in the first place. But once they had the tariff, they just stick with their tariff. But they couldn't choose like a more speedy service. I think they could just go with the less expensive version, which might be more important to some customers in general. But however, they just stay with their.
Okay, so they are just they're just 2 different tariffs they can choose from, not 4, for example. Or
there were 4 different options.
Yeah, but what are the different options? I'm trying to figure out what different options then are. Because
I think there are just 2 options: the speedy service, which is more expensive, and a cheap price.
But there's written 4.
It would be then, from my assumption, would be speedy service, expensive price, speedy service, low price, slow service, high price, slow service, low price.
Okay.
And what the point here being, as Alice has she pointed out that the people who focused on the speedy service wouldn't even have gone for the lower price because they wanted to maintain their speedy service, whereas the customers who were offered speedy service still went for the lower price because they always wanted a lower price, and that was their main preference.
Okay.
Okay. Then Anton,
I just got a question to regarding the anchoring effect. So my question is, where in this case is the biased estimate that Jane makes? So I think in the definition it says that you have a biased estimate due to an anchor that is set out before you make that estimate, right? So the anchor is that originally it costs 1,700, but then the salesman says, okay, for you there's a discount. Now you have 340 euros off, right?
Exactly. So for example, over here, they are trying to explain that the anchor is that, it's been marked down by 20% this week, and it's marked down this week only. So that's how you anchor in the customer, and she's kind of sold because of this discount, because they think of it as, okay, 340 off, and they're immediately willing to buy it, even if they don't, have a target in mind or a set price in mind.
And where's her estimate?
So for example, over here, it's just, there's no kind of a figure that's given to you, but you just know that she's convinced by the model, the first model. So, it would be more like a bargain that she feels she's getting versus having, like a set thing in mind that, okay, I want to spend so much. So maybe even if she was given the product earlier, which would have been 1,700 minus 340, maybe she wouldn't have been as impressed by the price versus being given 20% off.
Yeah, okay.
And thinking it's a deal.
I see. Thank you.
Great. So the chat, the anchor is less than the normal price. Exactly. So for example, you have it's basically trying to show that how people would respond to discounts or would respond to a price. And even if they don't have something in mind, this is just one way in which you use it to, you use marketing strategies to get a person to purchase the product. And so sometimes you even see like products are priced up and then put on sales, and that's how B2C marketing works. And that's using anchoring effects. So someone may not even, or someone may be willing to purchase something for 30 euros, and when it's marked down, for example, from 50 euros, they are more taken by it than just being marked by 30 euros itself, and they may not want to purchase it then, even if the value is the same. So I hope that's clear for everyone. Okay. Then there's this marketing mix that we are using in B2C and B2B marketing. And we are comparing different models that marketers use in a B2C context. And we are focusing on freemium and flash sales over here. So what are flash sales? You typically see these on online sites like Amazon, where they have like a limited time period and they put you under this pressure to go for the deal, or they have the deal of the day. And as consumers, we think, oh, I'm never going to get this product at a cheaper price. Or you have Groupon, you have different sort of websites that provide coupons to people that would be valid only for a time period of maybe 2 days or a week or one day itself, and it's running out, or ablaufen, as you say in German. And then you have freemium strategy, which is something that a lot of tech products or a lot of apps are using these days. And you basically have a free model, a basic model, and then customers are asked to opt for the premium model and pay a higher price for it. So LinkedIn, Spotify, Dropbox, all these companies use this model. And we know that we'll come to advantages and disadvantages of this sort of a model. And just think about these as a consumer, or as from a marketer's point of view. For example, which could be pain points depending on how consumers behave or react to a freemium model. And I'll give you all the floor at this point of time if anyone wants to highlight a few advantages or disadvantages for the freemium model. With respect to the question, why isn't it place promotion, we compare sales, and we compare, this is just a way of saying it. Even for B2B, we said communication, and your communication is your promotion and your sales is the place. Yeah, anyone wants to go? Advantage, platform effect, new advantage, endowment bias, advantage, new users attracted. Great answers. And especially new users attracted is something that we focus on in the freemium strategy. And we say that, okay, you acquire a huge new user base, and for startups that are relatively less known, it could be very helpful to build their user base, and then your number of users increases, and this kind of creates a potential for advertisers to come on your app and be willing to pay you for it. You also would have low marginal costs. Now, a question came up yesterday about what are these marginal costs. So for example, to add one user is not going to be very expensive in a freemium model. For a gaming app, for example, you have 100 users versus 120 users. It's not going to be too expensive for the company to cater to even 20% extra. You have minimal marketing costs, and it's easy to build a relationship with the company with this particular gaming app and your users. And the only disadvantages that could be there in this kind of a model, a freemium model, is that sometimes your basic features may be so great that people don't want to pay and upgrade to the premium model. And if any of y'all had been using Spotify since, I don't know, 4 or 5 years, y'all would have seen that their basic free model initially was much better than the free model that's offered now. And that's because they wanted to get people, they wanted to increase their conversion rates, and they wanted to increase their customers from non-paid users to paid users. And so what happens is, so for example, you have a lot of freeloaders in a freemium model who may still not want to pay a higher premium. And then it might be expensive to keep these costs for these free users running because they are generating very little revenue, maybe through advertisements or marketing activities. But you have to still maybe, you have to have a technical service team that helps them out, or you have your costs, operational costs that might be expensive to, have these customers as part of your customer pool. What may also happen is that people may perceive the entire app to be of low value because it's offered for free. And if this is the only product of the startup, it relies on your generated revenues, which may be low initially, and you may run out of an investment and not have another product to back you up to get your cash flows in, and you don't want your startup to die out that way. The chat disadvantages free riders. Why do we have minimal marketing costs? Because it's a free app, so you have it basis word of mouth, or you don't need to necessarily go out and you just have people downloading it because it's free. Advantages, differential pricing depending on customer preferences. We'll see differential pricing that could be used, or loyalty programs that could be used. We'll see it as a later part of this tutorial. But differential pricing is basically what freemium models are, where you have a basic and then you have a premium model. Or sometimes, you have tier 2 as well, depending on how much people are willing to pay for it. And yeah, so any other questions? Otherwise, I will move on to one of the most important parts of this exercise. We have about 40 minutes left. So now we have different ways by which we can identify important customers and segregate these, which really help companies identify which customer pool or which customer they should be focusing on. And we use ABC analysis, customer portfolio scoring model, and CLV, which is customer lifetime value. Here in the exercise, you will be given mainly CLV, and then you have to analyze, interpret results, and come up with solutions for to advise as a marketer, advise the company as to which company or which customer they should be focusing on. And the concept of CLV is you're seeing it's a fundamental indicator to differentiate customers, and we define it as the net present value of future cash flows that you expect the organization to receive from the relationship that they would have with the customer. And that's why even in the formula, we'll see that there's this discounting factor, which all of you all would have learned in finance, that plays out into CLV calculation. And you multiply that by the retention. You take basically a profit that you make from the customer, you divide it by the discounting factor to get your net present value, and then you multiply it by a retention rate. And this is the formula for it. As I mentioned, what is T here? It's the time period, and R is your revenue, C is your cost, divided by 1 plus I is your discounting factor. Please don't confuse D with I, because D is not your discounting factor. I is your discounting factor. D refers to your retention rate. So for example, you might, be given a 5-marker problem, and you might be just given the value of D and I, and don't assume D to be the discount rate. It's your retention rate. I is your discounting factor, your interest rate. And to understand it better, as I mentioned, this part is discounting the future value to get the present value, and then you multiply it by a retention rate. And what's R minus C is generally your profit. It's basically your profit. And then we also have why we are explaining these different M, N, T. So M will play in when you have infinite periods. This is your CLV calculation when you have finite periods, as mentioned here. So for example, you're given that the customer is going to be locked in for 2, 3, or 5 years, versus when a customer is not locked in for a period of time, you have infinite periods. And over here, what gets quite confusing for students, or just confusing, is, you're assuming just your M value for a period of time t, which would maybe the base year, or your t equal to 0, which is the current year. And that confuses students, because normally you may have extra costs in the future, or your revenues may increase because you kind of stand as a monopoly for a longer period of time, or they may decrease because of competition, or you have customers saying, hey, I've been your customer for the past 10 years, give me a discount now. So for that reason, over here we make certain assumptions. And these assumptions, for simplification, we say, okay, we're ignoring acquisition costs and we are assuming a constant retention rate, which is your constant D value. And we are averaging out your net cash flow. We are assuming a constant interest or discount rate, and the payment at the beginning of the period, or your M value, which is your revenues minus cost at the beginning of the period when the person's becoming your customer. And for this reason, we use a different formula for infinite periods, which is M. M is basically your R minus C for that time period, revenue minus cost profit, into 1 plus I, your discounting factor, divided by 1 plus I minus D, your retention rate. And that's why we are saying expected lifetime value of as yet to be acquired customer can serve as an estimate of how much they are willing to spend on the acquisition. So now take a minute, guys, and try to figure out where each of these different figures that are given would play out as costs versus revenues. And then I've made an Excel sheet. You all will not be getting the Excel sheet. You all will only be getting the solution slides. But to make it easier to explain, I have created that sheet. And take a minute, read through it, segregate your revenues, costs, try solving, getting your part A, customer lifetime value, after discounting, multiplying your retention rate. And I'll just present my screen with the Excel. Okay, so in this case, we can see that you have certain amount of revenues that were quite directly given, where you're being charged in your first year, which is T equal to 0. I've put T over here, and 0, 1, 2, 3 for your following years, 22, 23, 24. I've put the interest rate as 10, your retention rate as 0.7. It's quite clearly given in the question to y'all. And you see, I've first put in revenues, then I'm putting in costs, and then I'm deducting. So let me take you all through revenues first. Your leasing revenues is constant for all years. Now the navigation system, it became a problem for a few students to understand why you have 40 euros and why it's not a cost, for example, to the company. But are you going to upload this Excel sheet? No, I can't upload this. Only what the tutors give me and what is in the tutorial slides will be uploaded. This is just something created for y'all to have a better understanding, for me to explain it to y'all in the time frame that I've been given. So yeah, the navigation system, for example, became a problem for students to understand why it's a revenue. So the wording of the problem is that over here you're saying that Mr. David is a little bit disoriented, and a navigation system is also included in the package for another 40 euros per year. So that means that he is going to be charged 40 euros additionally because you have for another, and your list price for Car2Go is going to be what what Car2Go has to spend, and that's going to become a cost for the first year. It's not mentioned for every year, and it's just mentioned as a list price. So that's why you don't have this navigation list price in the following years. It's a one-time payment, whereas it's still going to be charged 40, 40, 40 over the next the period of time, 3 years period of time, to set off how much the cost is going to be for Car2Go. And then your insurance and taxes quite directly given, 2,500 for each year. Your yearly checkup, you do a multiplication where you have over here, you've been given that it's costing, you have a mechanic who's working 10 hours, who gets 50 hours, 50 euros per hour, so 10 into 50, and spare parts would cost 500 additionally per year, which is why you add 500. And that results in 1,000 for each year. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the navigation list price. So you do a total of your revenues minus your costs, and you land up with 16,391 in the first year. Second and third, I mean, T1, don't get confused with second and third, because I'm referring to T0 as 1 when I'm talking about first year. But basically, in your following 2 years, you have 16,540, because you don't have this cost of the navigation list, the navigation system as an additional cost. And now this part, row 18, is where we are discounting the net revenue or your cash flow, how you normally discount it in a finance class, where we are taking this net revenue, which is R minus C from the formula. We're dividing it by your discount factor. Over here, your discount factor is 10%, which is 0.1. So it becomes 1 plus 0.1, which is 1.1, and raised to t. Now, t is equal to 0 in the first year, as I mentioned. So over here, your denominator will automatically become 1. And that's why you have your net revenue for, t equal to 0, the same. Ignore d in this when I'm explaining row 18. And then for your next year, where t equals to 1, you have a discounting factor where you have 1 plus I raised to t, and t is 1. So you divide this figure that you get, 16,540, divided by 1.1, and you get 15,036.36. And similarly, you can't do the same calculation for year 2, because in year 2, your t is equal to 2, and it's raised to 2. So you divide it and you discount it to get your future, your present value, and you get 13,669.42. And just please complete the step, because even, I mean, when I'm explaining, I may tend to forget, but yeah, I mean, the Excel I've created is to remember each step that we have to do in the formula, multiply this by your retention rate, and that's when you'll get your CLV when you add up all three. So when you multiply, for example, your discounted income surplus or your net revenue by 0.7, in this case, I've just applied a simple formula, but you do 16,391 into 0.7, you're going to get 11,473.70. And similarly, you multiply each of these values by 0.7, and you get these values, and this you add up, and this is your customer lifetime value for your customer. And as you see, we add it up, the sum is 31,567.75, which is what I put here. So let's see the chat. No one's raised. Has anyone raised their hand? Hugo, you've raised your hand.
Sorry.
From last time. Okay, let me see the chat then. Oh, it's given in the question. How can we know that it will stop in 3? Exactly, it's given in the question. So that's how you know it's a finite period of time, which is why you use this formula and you're not using your infinite. Don't make that mistake, because you won't get your full marks then. Then 36 months means 3 years contract. Yeah, okay. I know it's just an example, but where is the cost for the car? It's a rental service, right? So we aren't really focusing on that at the moment, because anyway you have to rent out your cars. So that's the reason we are not calculating that in this example. 2 people raised their hand. Yeah, Alice and yeah, Evelyn. Yeah, Alice.
I have a question, like this 1 plus E. Okay, in the first year, like so we use 1,1, and the t is 1, and in the second year the t is 2, and in the third year the t is 3, or how?
No. So for example, we are seeing t is 0 for this year. And then t is 1 and t is 2, and that's why when you have, for example, in this case, you have 16,931, which is corresponding to your R minus C figure, revenue minus cost. You're using the discounting factor of 0.1 divided by 1 plus 0.1, which is 1.1. And when you raise it to t, where t is equal to 0 in the first year, that's the reason you're getting the same answer even in your discounted surplus for this, because anything raised to 0 is equal to 1. So that's going to lead to the same answer.
Okay.
And then for the following years, you use raised to 1 and then raised to 2. Yeah, GI.
Yes, so I also have a question. So for example, if I do the deal in 1st January, but the payment is done at the end of the year, so why don't I need to discount it? Because that is also like a whole year.
You're calculating it when you have a sum like this. You're saying that, okay, we're starting the contract from now itself. So your future cash flow, you would still, you still have that for this particular year, and you're assuming that your interest rate will play out for a future period of time, which is for your next 2 years.
Okay, so this year, even that is like 1 year break, but I do not discount it.
You don't discount it for 2022.
Okay, yeah, got it. Thank you.
No worries. Then you have could you back to the field of discounted net revenue? Yeah, okay. Will it be given in the exam of payments at the beginning of the, it should be given, but ask this on Ilyas as well if you all want more clarity. You can ask it with respect to CLV, because I'm not setting the paper, so I don't know what will come. Your assistant professors or the PhD students might be able to help you all better. But yeah, so going back to discounted surplus or discounted revenue, this is what I use the formula for this part without multiplying it by D, where I took R minus C, which is R minus C, and I got this, and I divided it by the discounting factor. So I hope everyone's understood the first part. This was your calculation of CLV. And as I mentioned, we use this formula because it's for finite periods of time. Be careful when, you'll see in the next part of the question 5.2, you will be using a infinite period of time. B part says interpret the results. Now I'll just show you all what you all will be getting as part of the solution style. You'll be just getting this. And interpreting the result, we say that, okay, the CLV is greater than 0, and that's why you invest into this customer. And that's you, and you asked to further, describe investing into it in comparison to your interest rate. And we are saying that, the customer yields a higher return than even the interest rate, which would be in the market at that period of time. And we say this because your net present value of cash flows will help you to achieve. So this net present value will help you to achieve the what target you want return in the coming years. And that's why we invest into the customer. That's the interpretation. Now the next part of the question, part C, was determine the CLV for infinite periods of time. And here you're assuming again the constant retention and your discount rate as same as previously. But here just use this formula where you're taking M. M is the revenue minus cost for that period of time. And here in that case, we had 16,391 in your first year, and multiplied by the discounting factor and divided by 1 plus I minus D, which is exactly what I did. I calculated my M for 2022, revenues minus cost, which is how I got this. And then I have, used the formula, multiplied this figure by 1.1, divide by 1.1 minus 0.7. And that's how you calculate CLV for infinite periods. Okay, Evelyn and then Alina. You'll raise your hands.
That just from last time.
Okay, Alina.
Yeah, I have a question for the infinite periods. In this case, we have a different annual income surplus in the first year, and then it's higher in the next years. Yeah. So shouldn't we discount the first year separate from the next following net income?
So this question even came in the previous tutorials, and over here I would say that you have, for example, even the first assumptions that we had over here, where we are making certain assumptions to make it simpler for you guys to calculate. So your margins will keep changing, but we are, using certain assumptions to simplify it for you all. And here they are saying assume beginning of year payments as well. So that's also relating to the question where we have, for example, people saying that, y is t equal to 0. Here you have assume beginning of your payments. And you can also assume that we are using m to simplify it in the first year itself, because for infinite periods of times, things may keep changing. You don't know whether it's just 2 years, 3 years, but at m period of time, which is what your formula says, m at t period of time over here is equal to RT minus CT, which is your margin at T.
Yeah, I understand that if it makes it simpler, but then it should be stated in the question, because here it is definitely not stated. Just like assume beginning of year payments doesn't clarify the correct process how to calculate it. So in this case, it would be incorrect, wouldn't it? Like in the M, it should be stated that we just use the first net income surplus in the first year, because mathematically spoken, it's just simply incorrect.
Mathematically, you would keep having different, costs, and in real life scenarios also you would have very different costs and different revenues. But if you want to understand maybe further on why academically we are using M, just go M as the first year, go ahead and ask on Ilyas.
Yeah, I understand why we do it, but just for the exam, for example, it should be stated. Like, I understand the different calculation method, and in real life, of course, there's uncertainty and different revenues and different costs for sure, but just for the question itself, it's just incorrect in my opinion, and then it should be stated in the exam as well. Like, I can also post it on Ilyas, because I think it's not pretty clear.
Ask on Ilyas, because I have no control over what comes in the exam.
All right, thank you.
Then I have questions from Julius and Anton. Anton, I think you raise your hand first, so go ahead.
I didn't get the beginning of Adeline's question. Maybe she already answered it, but why do we take the 149 euros from the navigation system, the cost, into account for the infinite M?
Because we are seeing it for, like, as I mentioned, costs will keep changing, and for simplicity, we do this.
Okay, so yeah, okay, what's that question? All right.
Yeah, Julius?
Yeah, I think it's already known in the chat from Jacob with the relevant costs, because yeah, for example, the 149s don't seem to be a relevant cost for me. And how can we distinguish relevant costs and unrelevant costs?
Yeah. Well, from our solution point of view, we are taking it for the first year. So we're saying that, okay, this would be a cost that is incurred in the first year, because you're going to buy it for Mr. It's not said that, you're buying it for Mr. David after a year, after he realizes that maybe he needs a navigation system, and we're going to be using the first year's value. So here we're just taking in all the costs. We're not, segregating between subjectively choosing, say, variable versus fixed costs. We're just taking all costs. And yeah, maybe this gets a little confusing, but it basically says that, yeah, just take all your costs. Then
okay, all right, thank you.
Okay, then we have the next part. So this is what you guys will be given. We will not share the Excel. There won't be any Excel. It's just used for me to explain it to you all simply. And this is your infinite period calculation, which is the same formula which I showed you guys. Then you have exercise 5.2, where you have a new sort of offering and a new sort of contract the firm may be going in for. And here we see, for example, this is Mr. David's wife, and she's planning to lease out the limousine for the next 3 years, very specifically given next 3 years, and for parties which take place twice a year. And we are calculating all these costs and revenues. Again, I'll share my Excel. I've put it in neatly there so you all can understand better. So we have revenues from 2 parties, and we say, okay, we're using that as X for T equals to 0, T equals to 1, T equals to 2. And then we're deducting your fuel costs, your operational costs. Contract charge is just for the first year. It's not there in the next 2 years. Decoration is 600 in the first year and then 400 subsequently. And then you have champagne and chauffeur costs for all 3 years. We're assuming it's all going to be 800, 800. There's going to be no change. And that's why your net revenue is going to be X minus 4,000 and then X minus 3,200 without discounting in your subsequent years. And so when we say we have to see what price, the question is how much do we charge Mrs. David to generate a positive CLV? So we have to see that her net revenue is going to be greater than 0, not equal to 0, greater than 0. And when we calculate this, we say, okay, that we're going to be considering even the discounting factor, because we know that this is for the subsequent years and we have to discount it. So that's how we get X minus 4,000 divided by 1.1 raised to 0, plus you add up everything considering the discounted surplus, and that we write as it has to be greater than 0. And when we get that, we say, okay, X has to be greater than 3,492 as the annual charge. And that's why annual charge is going to be for 2 parties, as we saw in the question as well. Divide this by 2 to know how much she should be charged per party. And when we go ahead and calculate this is just, you open up the bracket and you multiply, you divide, multiply, you do your simple calculation that you all will all be, you all know how to solve this, and divide it by 2 because you're doing it per party. And I see someone has asked a question, why decoration is 600? Is it just supposed to be 400 and then 200? No. Decoration, did I put this in wrongly? No, so for example, we say it's going to, like, acquiring these decorations is going to be, that much, and then it's going to be 200 extra per for the following ones. So it's going to be, say, initially you have your 200 for each of them and then 400, 400. Let me just check this though, because yeah, even that's what solution I was given by the professor, 600 and then 400, 400, where we are assuming, okay, acquisition will be an additional cost in the first year. Then, yeah. Where is the, so we're not necessarily taking into consideration over here any sort of extra multiplication for the retention rate, and we're just saying that over here your retention rate would be equal to 1, and that's why we are multiplying it by 1 at this point of time. And we're seeing your CLV has to be just greater than 0. And as per what the solution that even I was given by the professor, I see that over here, basis the calculation, they haven't multiplied it by 0.7, for example. You have it as a retention rate of for Mrs. Davis as 1, so that won't affect your calculation. Mrs. Davis is always going to have a retention rate of 1. So yeah, that's how you get 1,746 per party. We multiplied it by 1. I did not show it over here, but you can write it multiplying, your retention rate as 1, going to result in the same thing. And then you're asked to compare your CLV as part B for Mrs. Davis and Mrs. Morrison. So that's where, again, I write down my interest rate, I write down my retention rate, and I say, okay, my revenue from Mrs. David would be 1,700 each. And then I say that, okay, I want to deduct my costs over here. and I get a net revenue of negative 600 in the first year and then positive, I discount this and I use the formula for finite periods of time. I discount it and then I multiply it by the retention rate. Because my retention rate is 1, D is 1, it's going to result in the same. And I add this up to get my CLV for Mrs. David, and I get minus 252.89. And then for Mrs. Morrison, I do the same thing. I have 4 parties of 1,700 each, my revenues. I deduct all my costs here. She doesn't want decoration. It was explicitly mentioned, no champagne, no decoration. I have a retention rate of 0.8, interest rate of 10. So when I have my net revenue, it's going to be basically your revenue minus your cost. That's simple. And for an infinite period of time, I'm going to be seeing Mrs. Morrison because there's no finite period given. So I'm going to use the infinite formula. And for this, I have 2,500 in my first year, where it's T0. And that's why when I use this formula, for example, I take over here, as you see, I take the CLV in M value, I multiply it by my discounting factor, which is 1 minus I, and divided by my discounting factor minus my retention rate. And my CLV I get as 9,166, and this is positive. So when you're asked to then compare the two of them, obviously you're going to be finding that Mrs. Morrison is more profitable or has a higher CLV. And that's where I'm coming back to the solution that you all would be given, where it's directly said that Mrs. David's CLV is lower, and that's why you invest in Mrs. Morrison and reject Mrs. David. However, there are certain different things that we keep in mind. For example, we say that because of Mrs. Davis, Mrs. Morrison came in with positive word of mouth, and that's why we cannot completely disregard the customer, and CLV may not actually reflect the importance of a customer. And that's where we use the other methods that were shown earlier in the beginning, where I showed you all the theory, where you're using, for example, customer portfolio analysis scoring model to actually then kind of finalize whether you want to go for that customer or you don't want to go for that customer. And we expect this sort of an explanation for it as well. Use other measures, example scoring models, customer portfolio to evaluate the customer. And then you're asked further on, would you rather invest into the to evaluate the prices by using CLV? And you go on to say that in exercise 5.2, they say that you're leasing it for the next 3 years, which is why you use a finite period of time for Mrs. David versus for Mrs. Morrison. There's no sort of a time estimate given, and that's why you use infinite period of time. Okay, I get it twice. So can we explain CLV in the exam? You can expect anything that we are covering in the tutorials. Maybe you won't get a sum that's as long as this, as per my experience, but you can get any part of it.
Okay, so it has been in previous exams, right?
You can check the papers, but I cannot guarantee, even if it's been there, not been there, whether it'll be there or not be there. This is something you can ask the professor for this particular exam directly, and if she's answering you, great for you guys, but I don't know. You can't expect anything, you can't say anything over here. Then we just have a few minutes left, like about 9 minutes. So I'm going to go to the last question. Here we are seeing a new customer loyalty view, where we are saying that not all loyal customers are necessarily profitable, and but somehow they play as word of mouth, and that's why we see how to pacify customers and how the loyalty structure. You have 4 different type of customers depending on how profitable they are and how loyal they are. And you generally assume that your loyal customers are less to serve, have a higher willingness to pay, and act as word of mouth. But your new view is that sometimes it costs more to serve even non-loyal customers or loyal customers, and sometimes your loyal customers are not worth serving because it actually costs more to serve them by just keeping them as customers than to let them go. And at the same time, sometimes they just act as only word of mouth customers. So that's why ultimately customers now need to focus on not just loyal customers, but also ones that are profitable for them. And we use this matrix that's used for understanding customer loyalty, where on your y-axis you have profitability, and your x-axis you have how loyal or long-term customers versus short-term customers they are. In your first section, you see that, okay, with a low profitability and short-term customers, you have strangers where these guys don't really fit into your company. Then you have these sort of butterflies wherein these guys are really profitable and great kind of returns and margins, but very short-term customers. And on the other side, you have barnacles who are very loyal or long-term customers, but they're not so profitable. And then when you have a high profitability, long-term customers, these guys are your true friends, and you really need to invest and keep these guys happy. Now you all were given this question where you all were asked to, you were given that a shopping mall has introduced a sort of membership free loyalty program. And as you can see, it's free for all customers and you get discounts on it. And then you have certain segments. I'm not going to have the time to let you all read through it. I hope you all have done that. But I'm just going to get to the first question over here, which is identifying and naming the segments, and then the implications of that the company would have in dealing with these different customers. And at this point of time, I'm just going to go through. I'm not going to make this interactive. I also unfortunately have a class after. So segment A that we saw, it was clear that these guys are strangers because of keywords like they buy only a few times and the margin is very low. Segment B, barnacles, because they had clearly these guys were only making high value purchases once in a while and they were not so profitable, but they were long term because of the term that was there, visit our store once a week in average. You had butterflies where you said these are short-term customers and you can't really assess how loyal they are, but they were highly profitable. And then you had segment D, which were your true friends, the wealthy females who were looking for high price products and frequent in your mall very often. So that's how we segregated and found out, matched each segment. Now, what's important is also understanding which segment of customers you keep looped into your program versus which segment you let go. So with strangers, we saw that it's too costly. As we mentioned earlier, sometimes it's not worth having these customers. And the implication is that you don't offer the loyalty program, or you expect a minimal purchase for these guys to be able to participate. You charge a fee to them to participate in this. And that's why, you treat these as complete strangers and don't give them any sort of benefits. Otherwise, it's going to put off your loyal customers. You have barnacles where you have these guys who are not so profitable, as I mentioned, and there your action should be as the company to assess the wallet size. And if the wallet size is low, you need to have a strict cost control, and there you may use the same formula that you use for strangers, where you don't offer a loyalty program, or you try to cross-sell, or you customize a newsletter especially for them. Then you have segment C, which were butterflies. Now, these guys are still potentially great customers, because the point is you need to get these guys to continue buying because they are highly profitable. So in this case, you cross-sell, upsell, keep them hooked on. How do you keep them hooked on? You may give them something like a special gift card, whereby they have to come back to your store and purchase from your store itself. And that's why they have to keep coming back and become long-term customers. And for your true friends, that's your segment D, you have to make sure that these guys are, so what happens, why this program fails is because maybe your true friends don't really know the options that are available for them. Your communication might not be of great quality, and you may not be able to tell them what benefits they have. And that's why our loyalty program is ultimately not working out. So you can't completely ignore this category, and you can't just say, okay, I'm not going to act upon this category, because you have to enhance your relationships with this category and offer them maybe a higher status loyalty program to differentiate. I think someone mentioned a differential price program over here. it could be by giving them more benefits, more incentives, access to early access, or access to special events, or early access to discounts. We see that happening quite often. Even when you go for shopping sales, your members get discounts, and a loyal members always said, okay, your sale opens for you on, I don't know, Black Friday sale opens for other people end of November. For you, it opens in the beginning of November. And this is how we use loyalty strategies, segregate customers into these 4 segments, and then find ways to retain them. Any doubts regarding this question? No.
I have one question, just for the implication. Would you say we could offer discounts for segment C or D, because they're not really price sensitive, right? But we still want to lure them and we want to keep them loyal customers, but because they're not really price sensitive from the profit perspective, like I wouldn't offer discounts to them. So what would you say? It's like a trade-off maybe?
So over here, for example, you're not directly given that they are not price sensitive in a way. Like for segment D, they've not mentioned anywhere. That's an assumption that we are making for segment D, whereas for segment C, they are directly mentioning that they are not price sensitive at all. So I would treat each of these differently, wherein maybe for segment C, you say that you build on their activities to get them hooked on, and that's why you don't necessarily offer them a direct discount, but you offer them a gift card, and they kind of are forced to come back to redeem it. So ultimately it may be cash out of the company or the firm's wallet, but in that sense they are coming back, so your efforts should be channelized maybe more towards those incentives, whereas for segment D, you're not directly told that they are price sensitive or not price sensitive. So I would not I would not directly go to assume that they are price sensitive.
All right, thank you.
Okay,
I also got a question.
Yeah.
Is it possible to say that we should attract the barnacles, so segment B, who are long-term customers but low profitability, with cross-selling, because maybe offer them like more opportunities to buy things, so maybe we can get more revenues out of there since they come regularly?
But again, the incentives would change here. Like for example, these guys seem to be more price sensitive. Again, we can't just assume it. Maybe they are just thrifty customers, and that's why we are saying you measure their wallet size and then focus on cross-selling activities, wherein with this product you might need to purchase another product, and that's how you increase your sales with these customers.
All right, thank you.
Okay, then if there are no more questions and there is no one having another question. Did I hear someone?
Yeah, sorry to just jump in here, but I actually had a question about the butterflies. Shouldn't the company maybe choose to invest to retain them at some point and then bind them to the company, or does it not make sense?
That's exactly the kind of implications we are given. So we are treating these guys very differently from the previous segment, which was not a long-term customer, you're strangers, and we are saying that we do try to keep these companies and these customers and build your activities to make them more loyalty building activities basically. And those are examples that we just gave, again, cross-selling or different kind of incentives that you would use differently with these customers. So you don't completely ignore these customers.
Yes, because to me it seemed like if we milk them or like hard sell stuff to them, it might be that they don't want to come back. I don't know. So that seemed detrimental to me. But I mean, with the examples, it makes complete sense.
Okay, that's great then. With this, I will have to leave the tutorial. If you guys have any further questions, do we have to? I would really request you all to ask on Ilyas, and I'm sorry I have to go at this point. I have another class, but if you all have additional questions, just ask on Ilyas and it should be clarified. Yeah. Thank you all for attending. Have a great rest of the week.